This is the first roundtable discussion about sustainability in the construction and quarrying industries. It's hosted by World Highways and Aggregates Business, and we bring together senior figures from three major players in the industry. Jeremy Harson, who is the Global Construction Market Director for Cummins, Henrik Aman, who is Head of Driveline and Electromobility at Volvo CE, and Dietmar Grimm, who is Vice President, Corporate Strategy and Sustainability Solutions at Trimble. I'm now here with Aggregates business editor Guy Woodford. Guy, what are we expecting today?
It's very exciting to be joined by Cummins, Volvo and Trimble's senior people who are experts on sustainability. I think a lot of the focus is naturally on what's coming next, the future, tomorrow. But I think we also need to look at today. So whilst there'll be a lot of talk, I'm sure, about hydrogen fuel cells and hydrogen internal combustion engines and the development on that, we need to look at a better job site where you can drive down efficiencies and thus generate sustainabilities. They're all doing a lot of work in making a job site more efficient today, which will then lead into some of the future drivelines and tech for tomorrow.
And there's an awful lot of development work that's going on there, and the companies are actually working independently. Do you think we'll see them being able to think about how they can possibly work together?
It's amazing what happens when it's in everyone's commercial interests, how things get done. And a lot of this is driven by the customers. The customers are now looking for, they're having contracts which stipulate from regional and national governments, they have to hit certain sustainability targets. Now, OEMs have to help them fulfill those contracts. So if they don't do that, they won't get the business. It's quite simple, really.
Okay, well, Guy, we'll see what they have to say, and I'll speak to you afterwards. For many people, the classic definition of sustainability reads, sustainability is all about fulfilling the needs of current generations without compromising the needs of future generations. Jeremy, I'd like to start with you and ask you if you agree with that overview.
Yeah, I agree with the definition and the overview. I think most probably would. I think it's more about how do you get there, right? You got to somehow protect that future, but also account for the needs of the current, right? And of course, there's a cost, right, to be green. There are technology limitations that exist today. Those are all things that have got to be balanced as we think this through. I think there are things that we could do today from a practical perspective that are actually pretty easy. A lot of this equipment is in the field 10, 20, maybe 30 years on the upper end. And the stuff that's, been released in the last decade or so, or even the last few years, is just a lot more efficient and more friendly from an environmental perspective. There are other things like HVO fuels and different things coming around that are drop-ins and could be done easily today where they're available. Definitely some scalability challenges and other things there. And then, one of the things that I've, kind of been pushing for a while, idle management, I still think there's a lot of untapped potential there. We did just a random test, to be honest with you, not intentionally looking for any specific site or operating requirement on a wheel loader that we put a kind of a makeshift stop-start system on. And I think just through their normal operation, depending on the day, they were like 30 to 45% idle time. And if you back that into what that means in wasted fuel and unnecessary emissions, it was 15 to 20% or so fuel economy that they could have gained just by turning that on. From a Cummins perspective, I think our role is really all about converting energy into power and having that portfolio of solutions, because there's going to be different customers, different applications, different use cases where different things are going to make sense. So from our perspective, we want to make sure we've got that portfolio available at the right time and really just kind of helping those customers along that journey. So some of them are in slices of the market where they're ready for something today. That's great. Other ones are kind of at that spot in the journey where they're more thinking through what they need to do and looking for a thought partner. So we kind of position ourselves in that way when thinking about sustainability.
Some really positive comments there, I think. Thank you, Jeremy, for that. Henrik, do you agree? If we go back to the statement, sustainability is all about fulfilling the needs of current generations without compromising the needs of future generations. It's a really interesting statement in itself, don't you think, Henrik?
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree to that. And going back to my company, Volvo Construction Equipment, we have our head purpose is actually building the world we want to live in. And I think it's a great purpose for our company that building the future for future generations in the right way. And I think it makes people going to work and feeling it's not only, so to say, for salary and those things. It's actually to do something for the human beings for the future. So I think absolutely it makes sense.
Dietmar, what's your opinion about this with this overview?
Yeah, no, I think I completely agree. And, for us, we actually found our entire sustainability initiatives around that statement at Trimble. And what we see it really is indistinct from Trimble as a company. I'll talk about that more in the, later in the conversation. But really for us, it's about driving productivity and efficiency gains that we want to see in society overall. And as a technology company, we have this opportunity to both focus on what Jeremy and Henrik were talking about, like immediate things we can do today, drive productivity efficiency today, and find innovations to do that even more so in the future. So what we see it as is, transforming the way the world works towards a sustainable future. And we break it out into kind of four major pieces as well for us, because we think it's about that overall societal impact. And when you look at how society has evolved over the last few hundred years in terms of our economy, it's really been driven through technological innovation, that we've been able to break free from what would be considered sort of this economics being a dismal science, where a couple hundred years ago, it was when we had about 1 billion people, we thought we were going to run out of resources within a few years, basically, right? We just passed 8 billion people just a few weeks ago on the planet, and technology's really driven that, right? And so what we see is what we want to be able to help drive through productivity and efficiency gains is, better business with improved productivity, improved profitability. That drives a strong economy and growing economy, which helps provide the resources ultimately for a successful society with high well-being, with improved wealth, improved health, improved education. And that also then ties into what we can then do to use those resources more efficiently so we can make sure we have improved biodiversity and ecosystem outcomes as well.
Dietmar, you've outlined what Trimble sees as the way forward. I'm going to go back to the Cummins point of view. Jeremy, how do they see their role to play a better role, I suppose, in a more sustainable future for our industry?
Yeah, I think how do you get that energy turned into work and do the things that need to be done in the field? I think we'll talk a little bit maybe later on in the call about some of the investments, but kind of looking at that well-to-wheel emissions view, how do we make sure that we're thinking through that whole chain, right, and offering the products that our OEMs and customers need to get that work done. And you'll hear from me again later. That's going to be our view. I think very much in the mix still is going to be advanced diesel. I think there's still a long way to go there, a lot of opportunity. We'll talk about some of the springboards that we have into different fuel types that we can run in combustion engines. Of course, we've talked battery, we've talked fuel cell, right? So we genuinely believe it's not going to be one solution, right? So we have to kind of prepare for several different solutions and help our customers think through what could be the right one for them. Sometimes it's going to be cost driven, sometimes it's going to be infrastructure driven, sometimes it's going to be environmentally driven, based on how you're operating, where you're operating, what you need to do. We again kind of really just try to be a good thought partner and constantly are looking at that portfolio of products that we have and thinking about how those are going to apply to the markets that we serve.
And Henrik, how can Volvo play a more sustainable future role in the industry?
I think we are trying to do our absolutely best here. We have tried this for many years. Actually, we had this as environmental. We had as a core value, I think, for 50 years. It's been a long time within Volvo that we have really worked to improve environment and so on. And Now we have, for example, signed up also for science-based target and so on to secure that we really meet, so to say, the future needs to have, so to say, a good planet for all of us for the future.
We're talking about good plans for the future, and we have to address the question of resources. How much resource are the companies investing in sustainable solutions? You've been very positive, all three of you, actually, but we do hear, obviously, across the media and through activism and people who are very worried about the future, that there are actually lots of challenges. So if we address that first, Jeremy, I'll go back to you. How much resource is your company investing in sustainable solutions?
Yeah, I don't have a dollar amount. I think my generic answer would be a lot. We continue to invest more and more in advanced diesel solutions. We full on expect there's going to be more legislative hurdles to overcome in the next 5, 6, 7, 8 years, right, depending on which market you're talking about. So we continue to invest in the diesel product line. On top of that, you've probably seen some of the things in the media around our fuel agnostic strategy. So as we're thinking about how do you move toward more green, and again in an affordable way, one of the big challenges that we talk about is scalability, and how do you find scale on some of those components when the market is really only ready to adopt in niches in a lot of cases, right? And we think that fuel agnostic is a really good solution, if nothing else, as a bridge product and maybe even a longer term one, being able to take a lot of those base components from a combustion engine that runs on diesel, and you think about the engine, you think about the after treatment portion of that system. Really when you go from a diesel to a natural gas or to a hydrogen combustion version of that, really what you're changing is kind of that top end of the engine, right? Cylinder head, maybe some air handling and fuel system parts. But at the same time, you've got a decent amount of scale on a lot of those base components. So while it doesn't make it equivalent to diesel from a cost perspective, it does help quite a bit, right? Because you're sharing some of that scale with what's going to be on the bigger volume for a while, I think, still in the diesel. Beyond that, since 2017, maybe even a little earlier, we've been investing a lot of money in acquisitions for different technologies. So we started out, acquired a battery company. I think it was maybe a year or two later, got into a company that we acquired that specializes in electric drivelines. So you've got those two pieces of it. After that, I can't remember exactly the year, invested in hydrogen company for fuel cells, electrolyzers, and I think most recently even have a joint venture with a company called Enprox that does hydrogen storage tanks. So we're really placing those investments for what we think is going to be the long-term future. The good part, I think, is most of this stuff is complementary to each other. So you share components, right? When you think hydrogen engines versus fuel cells, all that tanks and generation of the fuel doesn't really care, right, what you put it in, right? Getting that hydrogen made and to where it needs to be and stored, that's something that can transfer independent if it's an engine or a fuel cell. And I think you could tell a similar story for a lot of those components. So again, it's how do you invest? How do you find something that scales across technologies, across markets? And I think, again, there's a pretty decent paper trail there for what Cummins has been doing in that space.
Dietmar, are Trimble able to match what Cummins are doing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think from our perspective, when you look at Trimble as a whole and you look at our history, we'd almost say that we're fully invested, like our entire company is invested in sustainability. You look at how we were founded, our technologies have always been driving productivity and efficiency gains. What's interesting is in our sectors, often people haven't recognized that as actually being sustainability, right? Because it's been something around, hey, we just want to reduce fuel use, but that is sustainability, right? That is a core part of sustainability. And so a lot of our investments in how we're thinking about driving a sustainable future is really reinforcing our continued product portfolio and how we view technology as playing this role. And importantly, our vision going forward, what we call our connect and scale approach, is that we're bringing, I like what Jeremy was saying, that there's really no one solution. There's really no one specific idea per se. We need everyone to be all in on this. I think market forces are going to be what drive this. And so we want to make sure everyone's thinking about how we can drive carbon emissions down. And through our connect and scale approach, what we do is we bring a platform of people together. We're trying to connect the entire construction industry to work together, basically, to drive those productivity and efficiency gains down from like an individual workflow on a construction site to how the whole thing works together. So you can think about when you're looking at construction overall, it starts with design, right? So the first step is design, working with architects to make sure you're designing things with lower embodied carbon and lower long-term operational carbon. The second piece of it is making sure you have site management optimized so that you're reducing the amount of emissions from site and also reducing the amount of rework and waste that happens on a site, because you can compare basically design to as built and make sure that it's going according to plan as you're doing it versus having to fix it after the fact. And then lastly, you have sort of operators, whoever ultimately owns the asset, they can manage that asset in a way by pushing the designers to make sure we're designing for lower embodied carbon and lower operational carbon, but they can also manage that asset longer term. So you're repairing it, thinking about replacement rates, because the longer you can use that asset, the lower long-term overall carbon emissions you have. And so we've been working with companies like Ecovia in Italy, where they have using a Wirtgen cold recycling system, where they look at when you ultimately have to replace something, hey, let's reuse the material. So they're reusing the asphalt as they're replacing the road along the way as part of the core materials in there. So we view, again, I think Cummins has actually described this pretty well. I've seen Jeremy describe it, that many of our companies have been driving sustainability for a very long time. Cummins has done a great job of improving, the power production with lower fuel use for the last, since the beginning of, the organization. And I think that's what we view as Trimble too. It's in our DNA. It's what we do. And what we need to do is all work together more effectively, collaboratively, to drive it together as a whole industry.
Can I ask the response when you've tried to get other members of the community to get involved with this conversation? Because you say that you're trying to do that. You want to work together. Is that actually working in practice?
That's a great question. I think so. I've met with several of Jeremy's and Henrik's colleagues, as we go to association meetings, and we're finding out that the sectors are wanting to talk about this, that we're working together more to understand what the solutions are, helping drive policies together to drive a sustainable future. At the end of the day, though, I do think that a big part of it is when it comes to especially carbon emissions as a component of sustainability, we have to just get much better at measuring it and sharing that information together. Once you measure something, then you can manage for it, and we can start to reduce it together. And that's where the shift over the last few years of measurability, sharing that information, looking at these things ultimately in terms of insets or accounting, offsets and other things, that's the way in which you can start to really optimize for reducing the total amount of emissions. And so I think we are starting to work together. Is there a lot more to do? Absolutely. There's a lot more that we can do as a sector together by enabling the process to be more effective in optimizing for reducing emissions.
Henrik, I haven't forgotten you, but I just wanted to ask one more question off the back of this, if that's okay. You talk about sharing information. We must get better at sharing information. That's about trust, isn't it?
Yeah, of course, it's about trust and so on, but it's also to develop things together with customers and partners and so on, I think, at the end of the day here. And I think it's very much what we are doing right now. I mean, to run this transformation that we really would like to be a part of and really driving, so to say, then we need to work together, so to say. And then perhaps also shift, also looking into customers right now, that the customers also wants to run this transformation, is also very eager to get new types of equipment that really support their targets to be CO2 free and so on for the future. So I think it's really from many different aspects we need to do this together.
And Henrik, from Volvo's perspective, how much resource is your company investing in sustainable solutions?
A little bit like Jeremy, I don't want to go into figures, but we are really looking into this right now, actually, and have a lot of focus on this. As I said here before, we have also committed to different targets. I mean, the science-based targets is one of those, and we have also said that from Volvo CE side, 35% of our equipment in 2030 should be electric, for example. So I think we have a huge commitment to do what we are talking about.
I'm going to ask all of you this. I've heard, diesel being mentioned, and you've mentioned electric. Is there anything that is not obvious that's being developed at the moment between all of your companies?
I don't know I guess maybe it depends on what obvious is. Again, from our perspective in off-highway, it really is, again, diesel heavy, right? I think that's going to be the prime mover for a while, so we've got to continue to push there. Battery, I think everybody believes battery electric will find its place. I think where that line gets drawn on any given type of equipment is probably the biggest debate point. I think there are a lot of things that you have to think about. How much energy do you need to have on board to actually get the job done? It's just very different from what we've talked about in the past when you're thinking about how you power a product. And then for us, in other markets, we're talking natural gas and different fuels. But from an off-highway perspective, it's really diesel, battery electric, and then hydrogen, either in combustion engine form or in a fuel cell form. And then, of course, there are hybrid installations and things along the way that I think most OEMs have. We participate in a lot of those today as a component supplier already. So those are the big ones. There may be some, something more niche or specialized that I'm not aware of, but those are the ones that most of the conversation tends to circle around.
Equipment manufacturers have an increasing range of powertrain options available to build into their machines. How should equipment buyers best approach these options when making their specification choices? And how should buyers evaluate what will best impact future sustainability and optimal fleet utilization? I'm going to start with you, Dietmar, on this question.
Wow, that's a really good question. And I'd probably defer to Jeremy and Henrik on how people can choose the specific powertrain options. I think for us, what we look at this is, as we're talking about before, what can you do today versus what's the future look like in terms of real-time optimization. So we're kind of agnostic, to be honest, on what the powertrain options are. What we want to do is make sure that we're driving those to be most productive and most efficient in that time frame in which you're using it, right? So irrespective of what it is, whether it's diesel, hydrogen, or electric, you want to use the least amount of that resource as you're moving forward. It's really an economic choice that each organization has to make, and that part of that economic choice is reducing the ultimate fuel use and probably not putting all your eggs in one basket. We're not seeing anyone saying that that this one choice, go battery electric for everything, right? What we're seeing more so is across the spectrum of things that we're working on is it can be very site specific. Certain kinds of locations are going to work really well for battery and electric because power supply is really nearby, grids nearby. Other places are more remote, and so they're looking at different ways to power that resource. And so it takes kind of like the pointy pencil analysis that you need to look at to say, within the lifespan that we have of these kinds of projects, we want to make a selection across these kinds of different powertrain options ultimately, because there isn't a clear winner yet, I don't think, that we see in the short run.
Henrik.
Yeah, but I agree. I think also it depends on a lot of different things actually here. So I mean, it depends where in the world you are, so to say. And I think different countries have different opportunities here to deal with all different things. It also depends what type of machines you are running. For example, an excavator can be grid connected and so on. That's not perhaps the thing for an articulated haulers that is running long distance and so on. So that's not the same thing there. And it's also perhaps depends a little bit about where you are, what you're doing with them, what segment you're into, so to say. Is it quarry, perhaps have a good ability of electricity, so to say, because they are running the other equipment with electricity already from the earlier, so to say. If it's a road construction, that might be more tricky, so to say. So it depends on different circumstances, I would say, what should be the right solution for different customers and different machine types.
Jeremy.
Yeah, I think your original question was how should buyers proceed, I think, or make a selection. Put simply, I would say thoughtfully and carefully. Diesel as a fuel, as a power source, has been really convenient, I would say, for a long time. Kind of spoiled us probably when you start thinking about how complicated some of the other things are. You spec an engine based on your peak power demand. It's pretty easy to find a spot to package the fuel on board to do a full day's job or a couple days job in some cases. When you look at some of the alternate technologies, you got to be a lot more thoughtful about what it is you actually need. And there's a lot of trade-offs that kind of come with that. Obviously there are cost trade-offs, there are operational trade-offs, serviceability trade-offs, environmental trade-offs, things that all have to be thunk through. From an OEM perspective, a lot of the conversations we have is, okay, you've got an excavator or a wheel loader or pick your piece of equipment, and it's so big, and how much runtime do you need? And I think generically the first answer is like, a full shift. Could mean a lot of different things, right? So when you start thinking about, is a full shift 8 hours, 10 hours, or is it only 4? That's going to drive, from a battery perspective, a whole lot more power on board. Batteries are big and add weight and cost and different things, right? And of course, charge times and all the things that come with them. From a hydrogen perspective, again, independent of which solution, the runtime really comes down to how much can you package on board. And without a doubt, the packaging is more difficult than diesel would be just based on the fuel itself. So from an OE perspective, I think there's a lot of a balance between cost and what do you really need. And I think those same things translate down to the end user perspective, because I think it drives a lot of interesting conversations. Mr. Contractor, Mrs. Contractor, do you need 8 hours worth of fuel? Or can you run 4 hours and do a top up, over lunchtime? Or do you even really run 8 hours, right? Maybe you really only run 3 or 4. I think it just forces you to really think through what your needs are versus what you're accustomed to, because it is just so different from what we've all kind of lived and breathed for the last, 100 years or 103 years now, I think for us, somewhere in that ballpark.
Jeremy, if we're looking at how you're describing, people have to really think harder and look at the situation that they're in at the time when making these decisions. There are still huge challenges, aren't there? It's clear that when all three of you are talking, there are still the same challenges in some ways. How optimistic are you, and I'll continue with you, Jeremy, and ask Henrik and Dietmar in a bit, that solutions will actually be found for these problems?
Yeah, I think optimistic, right? I think the timing of when the solutions will come for any given use case is really where the conversation is. A lot of I call them, I think, site-centric applications today. I think somebody mentioned a port or something, right, where you've maybe got a population that lives there its whole life. It's big enough that it's going to drive some financial sense into that investment for that charging infrastructure locally. I think it's great. A lot of those areas are probably going to adopt first and adopt faster. Other things where it's more of a nomadic type job, that's obviously going to lag. So positive in that sense. And then, of course, from our perspective, I think a lot of probably the solutions are going to come in the hydrogen space, just because we tend to play in a little bit of the larger equipment, where the power demands and things are a little bit higher, or a lot bit higher. We're again trying to build out solutions that work today and will work tomorrow. And even in a lot of places where we think, fuel cell is going to be the long-term answer, and I think in a lot of places we definitely do think that's going to be the long-term answer, it may not be right just now. And then I'll come back around to that comment I made earlier about this fuel agnostic platform based on diesel. With off-highway, I think we're really curious and really interested in the hydrogen as a fuel. One of the reasons we're interested in that is because from an OEM perspective, I think, right, a lot of folks are looking at investing in a zero emissions or a low emission solution with not a whole lot of volume to back it in the very near term. For me, that would make it really difficult to justify going full in on electrifying a full machine if I'm not sure that it's going to, turn into a decent amount of volume pretty quickly. I think something like these hydrogen combustion engines that we're talking about, from an OE perspective, yeah, you got to package hydrogen and other things, but you can pull out a diesel engine, drop in the same engine platform, right, powered by hydrogen, package the fuel, and it lets you kind of ease into that a little bit more. And of course, all the electrolyzer and hydrogen generation stuff that we talk about, those storage tanks I mentioned before, all that stuff really transfers from combustion engines over into the fuel cell space. So we've got a nice opportunity and a lot of optimism for, I think, how those products are going to help us ease into this. Maybe ease is not the right word, but work our way into this in a little bit more of a rational and phased approach in a lot of the applications that we serve.
Henrik, what are your thoughts on this?
No, I'm also very optimistic to this. I think actually we have the technical solutions and so on, and they are continuously developed as well here in improving. So I think that we will go in the right direction for the environment. That I'm sure about, so to say. Then different solutions will be go for different markets and different machines, as I said, and it will go different quickly from that aspect as well. So it will differ a little bit, but I am very optimistic for the future. Absolutely.
Dietmar.
Yeah, I mean, I have to fully agree. I'm extremely optimistic for a couple of reasons. One is, as we talked about before, all of our companies here, Volvo, Cummins, Trimble, we've all been driving sustainability for a long time. And a big piece of that is because it was already incentivized within the economic system that we have, right? We didn't call it that, but we've been driving fuel use reduction for since the beginning of each of these companies, more or less, at the end of the day. And so the incentives are there. It's like the current system was, hey, burning fuel was very tied to burning dollars or money, let's just say, currency around the world because it was expensive and it costs money. So we want to reduce that. That's how the system works. I'm extremely optimistic because now we're transitioning not from just calling it dollars where we've been improving those efficiencies, but now we're integrating carbon emissions as another metric that we need our system to start to optimize for. So we want to make sure we're reducing those carbon emissions. And we're starting to get much better at thinking about how we account for that, how we put that into our company financials. Henrik was talking about, Science-Based Targets Initiative. Trimble has also joined Science-Based Targets Initiative, which means that we are putting ourselves, on a plan towards, net zero emissions or Paris Accord goals by 2050, and have our own emissions be reduced, and also accounting for thinking about offsetting for remainder emissions in that period of time. So our companies are really taking this very seriously, and thousands of companies have now joined Science-Based Targets Initiative within the last few years. So our economy overall is driving towards having a great, tied into our economic system incentives towards reducing carbon emissions. And lastly, I do think that we're all believers in our companies because we're all technology innovators. And at the end of the day, you go back to my first comment where, as a world, we used to think of economics. I'm an econ person by training and a business person by training. So, back in the day, it was, hey, economics is the dismal science because we're going to run out of resources. This was a couple hundred years ago with Thomas Malthus, right? We're going to run out of resources and it's not going to work. But what we had was technology innovation and the green revolution that really proved all of that wrong, right? So I am a big believer in how technology can do that. We're just at the beginning because now we're starting to quantify, we're providing the data, and that's a big thing for us is connecting the physical and digital worlds, get the data available, because if you put the data in people's hands, they're going to do a great job of optimizing it within our economic system. So I think it's we have a bright future ahead of us, and hopefully we can just ramp and scale faster. That's the key thing for us. Long term, I'm super optimistic. Are we going to have some challenges in the middle term? Maybe. And our goal as our companies is to help drive that to be faster. And I think we're all doing, our best to try to make that happen.
Yeah, and this takes me on to the next question, which is, other than driveline choice and equipment type, and you've been expanding on this, what other factors affect contractors' ability to deliver a more sustainable on-site performance? And can you suggest any practical early steps that operators can take to lock into some of those benefits? It is about adoption, isn't it?
Yeah, for me, it's definitely about adoption. And, what I encourage, everyone to do is, because we don't know what all the solutions are, again, as a business person, economist person, I think that what you want to do is get the data, right? The data are going to help you understand how to make the choice. What's the biggest way you can reduce your emissions? And so first off, it's sort of just a very basic thing. Start accounting for the carbon within what you're doing, whatever it is that you're doing within that system. And there may be choices that you just didn't even think about that might be really important to you. So some of those things could be the biggest opportunity might be around just changing your cement mix. Cement's one of the biggest emitters overall around the world, and there's new technology innovations that are purely cost effective right now just by changing from Portland clinker cement to new methods with different mixes that can dramatically reduce your emissions on site, right? So for me, it's really thinking about those kinds of things, and then also working with that full ecosystem You want architects, the contractors and the owner operators to be thinking about this stuff together, because the incentives need to be aligned throughout that whole part of that system. Otherwise, if you're thinking about it individually, you may not optimize for that long-term carbon reduction. And so for us, it's really about thinking about quantifying the information, sharing thought leadership. So that's a big thing that we're looking at too. So we have a part of our website, civilconstruction.trimble.com/sustainability, where we share that information. The goal is get more of that out there, so that we can partner in driving a sustainable future.
There's that word again, sharing. Jeremy, what are your thoughts?
I agree with a lot of the comments that were just made. I think, for a lot of folks, some of the operational stuff, fuel burn, different things, maybe in a lot of cases has been kind of out of sight, out of mind. I do believe the data availability and having that in front of people is probably going to bring a lot of things to light that maybe people weren't thinking about before. Bringing it back to a couple of the things I mentioned earlier, equipment turn, how do you bring older equipment up to newer spec, things like idle management. I think part of the challenge that we've probably had is how do you convince people of the value of that, right? It's just another thing to deal with in a lot of cases. If you look at what we've done over the course of the last 3 or 4 emission changes, you're talking, 5 to 8% fuel economy benefits in one, another 5 in the next, another 3 in the one after, more coming down the line. If all of a sudden now I've got a fleet report for all of my equipment and it shows me some kind of a vintage of equipment, how much fuel I burned, it's probably a pretty short trip to be able to think about, okay, I can monetize the value of upgrades. Similarly on things like that idle management, if you take that example where the operator was idling 30% of his time, the fuel burn is the obvious one, right? Maybe his management or operations folks didn't realize that to start. That's one piece. Carry it another step further, most of the maintenance happens on a schedule, right? So if you're not idling 30% of your time, all of a sudden your 500-hour oil drain interval lasts a lot more in calendar time. And then further, looking into that, you're also not racking up hours on the machine, right? It's not going to show up as, all that idle time, and that really affects your kind of end of life or resale value. So I think being able to see a lot of this data and really kind of helping folks think through how you monetize that, and you can make improvements that are going to be really, really good for the environment. And I think they can also be really, really good for the bottom line for a lot of these operations if you start thinking through them a little bit more.
Henrik.
I think also we can do lots of things already now. I mean, a little bit, I think what Trimble was into here is how do you optimize the work site, so to say, how do you run all the machines in an optimal way and really utilize them in a really good way. So that's one thing that is we can do already now then. Then, of course, that we've done for a long time is actually driver education. I mean, you can save a lot of fuel just to educate the driver how to drive the machine in a efficient way, so to say. So, I mean, there is different ways that you can do that. Then we have actually also started to build machines with fossil-free steel for selected customers and so on. So it's a completely other way then to protect the environment, to go that route as well then, of course.
I'm going to move on now to the extent, or what extent can autonomous operation benefit the industry, not least because of the challenges involved in finding skilled operators. And are all machine and driveline types equally suited to autonomous operation?
I don't think all are suited, but I think some are actually. And then I think, as you say, that to find drivers can be tricky at different markets and so on. And I mean, different types of automation will absolutely support then the driver then. I mean, we have solutions like dig assistance and terrain memory and cruise control that is rather low level automation. Then we have a system that is totally autonomous. Then, like we have what we call the Tara system, that is small haulers that is running, so to say, without driver in a fleet, you can say them. So different things then. But I think different machine types are a little bit more or less difficult to automate at the end. But then, of course, we also have the 5G, and the opportunity 5G gives that they can run teleop, so you can have the driver sitting 100 miles away actually and driving a machine far in the forest or in a dangerous place in a mine or whatever. So it's another opportunity that we're also looking into.
Dietmar, what are your thoughts about this?
Absolutely. This is an area that Trimble is very focused on, I would say. And, two major aspects of sustainability that we believe are important. One is actually safety. So in the long-term future, as we start to see some equipment that might be operatorless, right? You end up not having a cab. And from a safety perspective, we see a lot of injuries on site are from actually getting in and out of vehicles. This is sort of inevitable. These are big. They're hard to get in and out of. Everyone's trying to reduce the amount of injury that happens, but that's where a lot of injuries tend to occur. So as you remove that, you'll end up having less injury. But really from a pure carbon standpoint, again, we think there's a tremendous opportunity. We basically did a study this past year as we're working to prove out how productivity and efficiency gains drive sustainability. What we did is we compared recently released product we had for an auto steering compactor, right? So you still have an operator in the vehicle in the compactor, and we compared an experienced operator to an inexperienced operator to the auto steering just driving itself. And what we found was a 15 to 30% efficiency improvement over those operators, and that directly means a 15 to 30% reduction in carbon emissions, largely because using auto steering, you can reduce overlap when you're doing compacting, and especially as you have to use the compactor multiple times over a site, it just starts to get more complicated for an operator to do that as effectively as you can when you have it purely mapped out through an auto steering and autonomous solution. So we see tremendous opportunity through autonomy to drive sustainability overall in the industry.
Jeremy?
Yeah, I think, we today, right, we participate in autonomous applications that are diesel powered, right? I think the question in there was, is one powertrain type better suited than another? Probably, right? I think you can do it on again, things out there today. We are doing it on things out there today. Some of the things mentioned like steer assist and other things. Obviously, as different portions of some of these machines start to electrify, I think it probably gives you a little bit more finite control over some of those operations. Obviously, I think the automation and the connectivity trends kind of go hand in hand. At least from our perspective, the farther removed person is from the cab, right? The more interest we have in making sure that asset's healthy. Thinking operationally, construction-wise, I think some of the dig assist type functionality was mentioned. I think traditionally, if I needed to dig a 2-foot deep or a 3-foot deep trench, I probably am in my excavator. I maybe take a couple scoops of dirt out. I get out of the cab, probably leave it running, go out with my measuring tape and say, nope, I'm 18 inches. I get back in, and I do that 3 or 4 times before I get it right. Through some of the solutions that folks like Trimble and others are bringing, you don't have to get out, right? Which means you're not wasting your operator time. You don't need a skill of an operator, right? We all know that's a problem, as you mentioned before, but you can get those jobs done a lot quicker.
Dietmar, I'm going to move on to new factors, or what new factors are coming into play in the sustainability toolkit. For example, green hydrogen. We've discussed this a fair amount today. Please tell us how you view this opportunity specifically, and how can buyers best deploy a more intelligent approach to the selection and operation of their equipment fleets?
It's a great question. Again, especially with like green hydrogen and other technologies, I think I've seen Jeremy speak to this really well in the past. It's still also unclear exactly how that is going to play out, as we talked about before, on specific locations, specific sites. And if I take a bigger step back, it's really the biggest transitions we'll see is just how all of this energy is produced, because there's different kinds of hydrogen, as we talked about. I mean, depending on how you define green hydrogen, and so on and so forth. For us, again, we end up becoming, because of that uncertainty, and the need to really get that pencil out to make careful choices depending on the job, the workflow you have, the site location you have. We're more about, again, trying to think about how do you optimize for any of those solutions. And for me, it's getting down to what we're seeing as customers, and Henrik can speak to this really well, I'm sure, in Europe, but we see it in the US and other parts of the world. Customers are just having to get smarter about understanding their carbon footprint and how they're going to be able to reduce it, because it turns out that who they're building for at the end of the day is starting to demand it. Whether it's federal agencies and other things, they're starting to require people to be able to report on that carbon or the carbon emissions they have, and how they can compete to reduce that compared to other contractors. It used to be price, as I was talking about. Things used to be always quantified in terms of price, but now carbon is part of that equation so that people can provide competitive bids for new projects. And one of those interesting aspects to me is when we're starting to quantify that through the accounting. And I think a big trend that is going to hit this space that other industries are adopting faster is around thinking about carbon offsets and insets in the sector. So how do you work as a whole construction site so that you can think about a net zero asset, whether that's a building or a piece of infrastructure, and you have to think across from design to operate or to site operations to the long-term operation to be able to do that, to quantify it all and understand, is it net zero? And to make that happen, you have this quantified carbon reductions that you're producing through that supply chain overall in that ecosystem, which would be quantified as an inset, and then thinking about, do you have to buy offsets down the road? And so getting more sophisticated in the industry about how we think about carbon insets and offsets, I think, is going to be a really important part of the economic equation going forward longer term, especially as more and more companies join the Science Based Targets Initiative, and as we see more and more federal agencies in different countries around the world requiring us to be thinking about net zero future.
Jeremy, do you agree? A more sophisticated industry, is that what's required?
Yeah, and I think, coming back to the hydrogen economy, the green hydrogen economy, obviously that's one that we have a lot of interest in as a company. Definitely are investing and believe that's going to be a critical part of the solution out in the future, especially in the part of the market that we serve. We are medium duty, heavy duty construction. A lot of that stuff is going to be more suited for hydrogen than probably some of the other alternatives that are out there. I think we're a little bit uniquely positioned for that to take off in the future with some of the investments that we've made. So, hydrogen generation through electrolysis, we've invested in companies and have that capability, and have talked about that in the public. Fuel cells, combustion engines, how are you going to consume that, as well as those tanks and other investments that we've already referenced earlier. So I think we're very well positioned, very much interested in that taking off. I guess thinking about how that plays out in the field, again, I think it's going to be the timing and how quickly some of these things come along is really going to be the question.
Henrik, what new factors are coming into play in the sustainability toolkit in your opinion, and how can buyers best deploy a more intelligent approach to the selection and operation of their equipment fleets?
Yeah, we start with the hydrogen, and I think absolutely, as we talked about here, it's an interesting thing here for the future thing. I mean, it's the problem is to store electricity normally, so to say, and I mean we have wind and solars and so on, and then the difficulty is to store it, and then of course the hydrogen can also then be used directly then into combustions, as Cummins talked about there, Jeremy, and so on. So that is a great opportunity then. And then, of course, we can use it in fuel cells and so on to get electricity and so on. And you can also actually think about to have power containers, so to say, in places where you don't have the electricity, but you can actually then get hydrogen to the place and you produce electricity to the machines if you have electrical machines on the work site since earlier, or that's also an opportunity. Then I think green hydrogen is also then an opportunity, for example, to produce fossil-free steel. So that is also an opportunity for that. So I mean, hydrogen can be used in different ways to be CO2 free in the future.
Henrik, I'm going to ask you as a final question. Have you got any final thoughts that you'd like to share with us?
Final thoughts. I think in general that it's very nice to sit here and discuss together with Trimble and Cummins and see that we have this common view on making the better world to live in, actually. And that I'm really glad about. And I think that is exactly what we need for future generations. So I think actually we have an opportunity of a lifetime now to do something good for future generations.
Jeremy, your final thoughts, please.
Yeah, I think, we've been, again, pretty out in the open talking about what we call our Destination Zero plan. So agree, we all seem to be, I think, marching toward a common end goal, and I think probably even some reasonably common interim steps. We can't get too fixated on only the 2050 picture, right? There are, again, those things that we can do now in the next 5 years, 10 years, 15, those incremental improvements that we're going to make along the way probably stack up to a lot more than if we all just waited for some light switch event to happen in the future. So I think it's really just going to take time and probably play out a little bit slower than a lot of us like, because it drives proliferation and a little bit of confusion. But I think it's all in the right direction, and agree. It's kind of nice to have these discussions where it's just more idea sharing and kind of seems like we're all really thinking along similar lines.
And Dietmar.
Yeah, I mean, I 100% agree. Really appreciate the opportunity. So just having the opportunity to speak together is great. So thank you for that. And obviously, it's wonderful to have these companies, Cummins and Volvo and us at Trimble, have the opportunity to speak in these cases. And then also, we're actually working together in many ways, right? And our technologies work together. For me, it's I do think we have there can be a little bit of frustration, but what I like is we as our companies are driving to push for the urgency that we need to make the changes, and we can start from this foundation of all of our companies again, and many of our customers and partners have been driving this. I want to always reinforce this: have been driving sustainability, right, and not really understanding it or knowing it. So I hope we as an industry can take that as a position of strength and say, let's actually take on the leadership mantle that we should be having, and say that we can lead the world towards a more sustainable future and drive with a sense of urgency. And part of that urgency is, with the technologies we have today, we can still reduce emissions a lot, right? So we need to have urgency for those emissions today. And there's going to be some new technologies along the way that we're uncertain about. So let's think about carefully how we drive that portfolio, and move forward towards that innovative future as well. But there's so much that we can do today. I'm so optimistic around the great changes that we can make right now to drive a sustainable future today, and that will then benefit future generations.
Dietmar Grimm, Vice President of Corporate Strategy and Sustainability Solutions, Trimble. Henrik Aman is Head of Driveline and Electromobility at Volvo CE in Eskilstuna, Sweden. And Jeremy Harston, Global Construction Marketing Director for Cummins Inc. Thank you all very much for joining me to discuss this. Thanks. Now that we've heard the discussion, Guy, what are your thoughts? Are there any key takeaways?
On the hydrogen side, I think there was an acceptance that, yes, that is the preferred way on the fuel cells and the hydrogen internal combustion engine. But there's the practicalities, as in everything. There's huge cost involved in R&D in this area, because you're talking about doing something like that, an alternative power at scale. Now, to do it at scale, you've got to have obviously infrastructure. Now, how that infrastructure is realized is going to be crucial. And you're talking about an alternative fuel like hydrogen. If you're truly wanting to make this a global alternative fuel source, you need to get buy-in from the Chinese, India, all the emerging economies. Are we talking about making this truly global? Or is this a question of the mature markets adopting this type of powertrain, this type of driveline first, and then it's rolled out globally after that? It's going to be very interesting, the timeline and how the infrastructure is delivered on this.
But Guy, we've seen from the Roundtable, no one actually has those answers, because those questions are being asked all the time. And not just for this Roundtable discussion, because no one does have the answers. And that collaboration isn't happening yet. Do you think it's ever going to happen?
No, I think it is. I think there's, as I say, there's an acceptance that it needs to happen. And I think there's a general willingness for best practice to be shared. I think we tend to think of the business world that everyone's working in silos and the competition. But this is a key industry goal. It has to be realized. There's an expectation from the customer. There's an expectation from the public to everyone to be going greener. And I think the OEMs themselves, they want to be delivering on this. It has to be able to be delivered at a price point where customers can actually afford to invest in plant that is hydrogen powered, that is highly green, zero carbon, and is sustainable.
Are there any other key takeaways from this discussion?
I think in terms of the companies you've spoken to there, I mean, the likes of Volvo on the hydrogen alone, they're investing heavily in developing hydrogen-powered haulers. Absolutely fascinating work, pioneering stuff. We're writing a lot about that in Aggregates Business. It's also a very strong interest to World Highways, our sister title. JCB, for example, they're developing a hydrogen excavator. Absolutely fascinating the work they're doing there. And also what's interesting from JCB is they're introducing a recharging station on site, because that's a key element of this. You can have an alternative power like hydrogen, but is it going to be delivered to your job site, or do you have it on site? If you have it on site, how are you going to store it? What are the health and safety implications? Also, you have other areas as well, which I think was touched on. The size of the fuel tank. You need a much bigger, potentially double the size of a diesel fuel tank to store your hydrogen. Plus, you're going to be running it for less time than you would a diesel tank. So 4 hours perhaps compared to 8 hours. So you've got more recharging to do, more potential downtime. How do you address that? How quickly can you recharge? These are big questions that need to be addressed. And it's fascinating as to where we go from what we've got now with the prototypes and some of these early machines, is how that is all developed and how you deliver that infrastructure for it to work across construction, quarrying, and other areas of the off-highway sector.
So I suppose if we conclude what we've learned from this discussion, I mean, you've just thrown up a whole load of new questions.
Sorry about that. Yes,
Guy.
yeah.
What are the final thoughts?
I think the final thoughts is very encouraging. I think that there is a lot more willingness to collaborate across the industry between OEMs. As I said at the start, the intro there, it's in everyone's interest for this to work. Absolutely everyone's interest for it to work. I think there's got to be arguably some regional differences to how this is approached. I think also you have large players and small and medium enterprises on the machine owners. The expectations, you have to sort of get everyone up to a certain level, so to speak, and it's how you do that. I think it's very easy to get lost in some of the big customers and the big manufacturers doing this, where you've got to bring the small and medium players up to the levels that you need to make this truly global. And that's going to be very interesting to see how the likes of Trimble, Volvo Construction Equipment and Cummins lift others, smaller players, if you like, within the industry up to the level required to deliver on the sustainability agenda.
Thank you, Guy Woodford, Aggregates Business Editor, for talking to us. There ends our roundtable discussion about sustainability in the construction and quarrying industries. A huge thank you to our guests, Jeremy Harson, Global Construction Market Director for Cummins, Henrik Amann, Head of Driveline and Electromobility at Volvo CE, and Dietmar Grimm, Vice President, Corporate Strategy and Sustainability Solutions at Trimble. I've been your host, Nadira Tudor. Thank you for watching.